Morning, everybody, from a very cold Cape Town. I hope everybody can hear me. Welcome to the workshop on tips on scholarly journal processes. This is the fourth of um, ASSAf's service webinars, really, for new journal editors. And thank you very much indeed for the ASSAf team, Maputi and Ina and Louise, for the huge amount of work that's gone on behind the scenes to make this webinar possible and to make people like me look good. My name's Leslie Swartz. I'm the editor-in-chief of the South African Journal of Science, and I'm going to be your facilitator today. I'm delighted to see that in terms of number of people who responded to us, there are close to 200 people have responded, showing interest in this session. We are recording, please note that. So far there are 62 people online, which is wonderful. And I've noticed that some of the participants are themselves very experienced editors. And what we're hoping to do is to spend the first half of the session, more or less, of the 2 hours with presentations, but then to leave approximately half the time for your comments and discussions. Please put all your comments in the chat, and it's going to be my job to manage those and put interesting questions to our fantastic panel. And we do have a wonderful panel. I'm not going to give you their full CVs. These have been made available to you, but just to go through them quickly, our first speaker is Professor Betty Mubangizi, who's from the African Journal of Governance and Development. She has a Saatchi Chair in Sustainable Rural Livelihoods at UKZN and is a very experienced researcher. Our second speaker will be Professor Jennifer Fitchett, who's Professor of Physical Geography at the School of Geography, Archaeology and Environmental Studies at WITS. He's an associate editor, I'm pleased to say, on the South African Journal of Science. So Jen and I work very closely together, and I can tell you that's a very enjoyable experience. Our third speaker will be Professor Christopher Isike, who's Professor of African Politics and International Relations at the Department of Political Science at the University of Pretoria, and the director of the African Center for the Study of the United States, and he's the editor of Politicon, the South African Journal of Political Studies. So you see, we've got quite a team for you today. Then we have Professor Christy Langeman. She's at the Department of Geography, Environmental and Management and Energy Studies at UJ, University of Johannesburg, and she also edits the Clean Air Journal. And the last of our speakers of today, and an important part of our team, is Dr. Pierre de Villiers. Pierre is well known to many of us. He is a specialist in open access scholarly publishing. He has edited a number of scholarly journals, and he's the founder and executive chairman of African Online Scientific Information Systems, which is the platform, I would imagine, for many of the journals which you work on. It was also the platform for the first journal for which I was editor-in-chief, which was African Journal of Disability, which was a great pleasure for me to work with him. As I've said to our speakers, my only job is to try and keep the ball rolling. And so each of our speakers has 10 minutes to talk, and my job after 7 minutes is to butt in and say, you have 3 more minutes, and to move us on to the next speaker. We have because I want to have a lot of time for questions and comments in the chat. So unless there are any other issues that we should deal with, please do look in the chat at the rules today, which Maputi sent you: keeping your camera turned off, sound muted, use of the chat box, technical difficulties, and so on. please just do check that. And I think we're ready to start. So our first speaker, I'm delighted to say, Betty. I haven't seen if you're on. I think you are. Yes, you've started screen sharing, and I'm delighted to introduce Professor Betty Mubangizi from the African Journal of Governance and Development, who will be spending her 10 minutes talking to us about the editorial process from submission to publication. So thank you very much, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Leslie, for that warm introduction. And thank you too for making it all look as though it's nice and easy. That always helps presenters to feel comfortable. I have to say that I'm really honored to be amongst the many people that are attending, and I'm seeing seasoned editors and seasoned academics. So I'm truly humbled that you thought I'm worth your time and you come to listen to me. So what I'm going to talk to you about is the editorial process, and it's from submission right up to publication. The process itself is a series of steps and procedures that are involved in the management and evaluation of content to be published. Of course, publications could be in magazines, they could be in books, they could be in a whole lot of genres, but we are specifically talking about the academic journal. And with that come certain expectations and particular responsibilities. You are aware that an academic program is a pursuit of knowledge. And the pursuit of knowledge is fundamentally the pursuit of truth. So we can't publish in an academic journal unless we are sure of the quality, of the accuracy, of the integrity of the content being published, so as to maintain the standards and to meet the objectives and scope of the journal, guarded and fundamentally informed by the pursuit of knowledge, which, as I said, is the pursuit of truth. So I'm going to take you through specific steps, and I have to say upfront that journals may differ, and it may also vary from field to field, but in the main, I'm going to share with you the 10 main steps of the editorial process. The first one, of course, is submission, where the authors submit the research manuscript to the journal for consideration, and with all the accompanying tables, the graphs, the supporting materials, covering letters, and most importantly, declarations. The declaration being that this is their own work, this work has not been submitted elsewhere, it's been generated through ethical means, etc., etc. So that's the submission stage. The second is the initial assessment. The initial assessment, it's done by the editor-in-chief or the editorial office staff. They first perform an initial assessment of the manuscript, and this is done to ensure that it meets the journal's scope. It meets the journal's scope, that there's no plagiarism at this stage. This is perhaps where one would use the Turnitin to make sure that there's no plagiarism. This is at this point, you also look at whether there's a possible conflict of interest. Is this person known to the editor? Is this person close to the editorial office, etc., etc.? And at this stage, there might be a desk rejection. If, for example, the manuscript submitted does not really fall within the scope of the journal, or if it is written in such a way that it does not really meet the requirements of the journal. So an editor may make the initial stage of either an outright rejection or a preliminary one where they ask them to make certain revisions. The third stage would be the peer review. So that if the manuscript passes the initial assessment, it is then sent to peer reviewers. This will be 2 or even more experts in the field who are knowledgeable in the field and who will evaluate the manuscript for its quality, for originality, for the methodology, for the significance, the currency, whether it is something new and something interesting, the validity of research, etc., etc. And then the reviewers will provide comments and suggestions, and they will give recommendations to the editor as to whether some work needs to be done or if it should be rejected outright. And then the fourth, this one feeds into the fourth, which is the fourth stage, which is the editor's decision. Based on the peer reviewers' comments and based on the peer reviewers' recommendations, the editor and the editorial board then make a decision regarding the manuscript. And they may decide an outright rejection with guidance on on why it's being rejected. So there always has to be detailed feedback and suggestions, because I believe really that an editorial process is a peer review and it should kind of be a supportive one. It should be developmental in a sense. So when a rejection, a decision to reject is made, it should be accompanied by a detailed feedback with suggestions on where, on how the author should deal with the rejection and the manuscript. The editor's decision could also be, of course, an acceptance, either a direct acceptance with no changes, which is very rare. But usually the acceptance is accompanied with revisions that are minor. The fifth stage is then the revisions, which are done by the author. If the manuscript requires revisions, the authors will modify their manuscripts according to the editors and the reviewers' comments, and then they will provide an error correction report. This would be a point-by-point explanation on how they have attended to the comments of the reviewers. And hopefully also at this stage also, the authors should make sure that they have proofread, that they have edited, and many editors, and I'm one of them, will require proof that the manuscript has at this stage been edited by a language expert. The sixth stage is
3 minutes. Thank you.
3 minutes. Oh, okay. Then I need to rush. Okay. The sixth stage is an optional one. It's a second review, which may undergo if it is necessary, but this is quite a rare one. The seventh one is a final decision based on the revised manuscript and the reviewer's feedback. The editors will make the final decision to either accept, reject, or require further revisions. The eighth is copy editing. This is really technical issues. Once the manuscript is accepted, it undergoes copy editing and typesetting. The ninth is proofreading. Authors might be provided with galley proofs, although this is optional, so that they correct and any remaining errors before publication. And finally, it goes for publication. The final version is allocated a digital object identifier. These days, most journals do that. It's then published either in print or online under a predetermined volume or issue. Just maybe to recap, submission, initial assessment, that's the hemorrhaging, it may be rejected there, but it might also be required that they go through a peer review process, the editor's decision, revision, second review, which is optional, final decision, copy editing, proofreading, and I've put this bomb, the article processing charges. Some journals will require that you pay article processing charges before the publication, although it is also not unusual for some journals to require the article processing charges after the publication. So in a nutshell, that is what it is. But I also would want to say that editors are not gatekeepers. Editors, in my view, are gateways, and they are guided by ethical guidelines and principles. to uphold the integrity, fairness, and transparency of the academic project. And so there are those important guidelines and principles that, that are fundamental to the editing processes. These include confidentiality, impartiality and objectivity, ensuring there is no conflict of interest, transparency, accountability, and on how to deal with corrections as well as retractions. So that is my input. I look forward to your comments and suggestions on how the editing process could be better tightened. Thank you, Leslie.
Thank you very much indeed, Betty. That was, and thank you for being so good about keeping to time. You've really given us a lot to think about, including something that's really important is that editors are gateways, not gatekeepers. And our next gateway person who is going to be talking today, and please keep your questions and comments ready for Betty for later. But our next speaker is Professor Jennifer Fitchett, who's an associate editor of the South African Journal of Science, and she's going to be talking to us about peer review terminology and expectations. Over to you, Jen.
Thanks, Leslie, and thanks so much to the team at ASSAf. I've been given 10 minutes to speak about three major terminology issues, one being the difference between single, blind, and open review, the second being preprint service, and the third being conflicts of interest. So I'm going to do my best, Leslie, to keep to time while I work through all of this. So to start off with single versus double blind versus open review, I think many of us have encountered this in the process of submitting our own papers to various journals that have a range of different processes. But we also know that each of the journals that we serve as editors for have a different approach in terms of this. So there are three major approaches that are used. The first is double blind, where both the authors and the reviewers are anonymous. The second is single blind, which means that one party is anonymous, which is usually the reviewer, but in that case, the author is not. And so the reviewers are able to see the author's name. So this will be up in the title bar. And then the third is open review, where neither the authors nor the reviewers are anonymous. And in many cases of open review, the reviews are also posted below the full paper for the public to read what kinds of comments were raised in the review process. So I found a fantastic image from a website called 4Waves, which gives us an idea of what this looks like. So double blind, both of us have our blindfolds on. Single blind, the author has their blindfold on, but the reviewer doesn't. And open, no one has a blindfold on. So these terms primarily refer to the anonymity of the authors and the reviewers during the review process. And the decision as to which type of review will be conducted is determined by the journal and forms part of the journal policies. So it would not differ paper on paper or depending on the author, and usually wouldn't differ depending on the type of paper submitted to a journal, and is normally stated upfront on the journal webpage so that both the authors and the reviewers are aware of their own anonymity in the process. If it is a double-blind review process, the author's guidelines will require that you ensure that your main manuscript document does not contain your name or any identifying details. So, for example, you would often find that details about acknowledgements or funding or even ethics might be in the cover page, which the journal will see, but which will not go out to review. And there is some responsibility on the author to ensure this, but many journals will also take a degree of responsibility in double checking that documents are sufficiently blinded. So why do some journals have a double-blind review process? The South African Journal of Science is one. Some journals have a single-blind review process, and the International Journal of Biometeorology is one that I serve on that is single review, or an open review. And the reason is that there are pros and cons to each approach, and there isn't a global consensus about which one is best suited, and arguably in some fields, one approach might be better than another. On the one side, it can be argued that reviewers will provide more comprehensive and critical reviews if they are anonymous. And if the author is anonymous, it can be argued that there will be less bias relating to their level of experience, their country of origin, or their field of expertise. So for example, we should be evaluating the work of a PhD student in exactly the same way that we are evaluating the work of a full professor. And by making the author anonymous, we have a better chance of guaranteeing that. But on the flip side, it can be argued that knowing who people are allows for greater contextual understanding of why they're writing, what they're writing, and in the way that they're writing. And many argue that anonymity can breed unfair criticism because people are hiding behind this veil of anonymity and feel that they can say things that they wouldn't say to your face. So there is a lot of debate about which approach is best in ensuring the most robust form of review while equally ensuring fairness to all parties. So what does this mean to you as the editor? If it is a double-blind review process, there is an onus on us as editors to check that authors' documents are blinded and to engage with authors who perhaps aren't aware of the terminology or aren't aware of where their details might be popping up. Equally, when reviewers submit their responses, particularly if they're using track changes in a document, doing a careful check to make sure that the reviewer's documents are blinded, including the metadata. And this is something that I have not been very good at double checking myself. And thank goodness for Nadia at the South African Journal of Science, who double checks all of this for me. It's also important to make sure that if you are working in a double-blind review journal, that you don't accidentally add the author as a reviewer of their own paper. And a number of journal platforms don't allow this to happen, but some of them doesn't have a system to automatically block that. And if you aren't seeing the author's names very openly on the document, there is a possibility of accidentally doing that. And then finally, if you're communicating the review outcome to the reviewers, to make sure that this doesn't compromise the blinding process. So making sure that you are not copying in the reviewers or the authors to communications to either in such a way that it would give their names or email addresses or similar. So some common mistakes that do come through, particularly where people don't understand the terminology or don't understand how to go about blinding their work. Often we'll see cases where when self-citing, authors blank out their names in both the in-text and the full reference citation. And actually that does the opposite, because it's easy enough to Google the name of the paper they're citing and then you'd find the name. So when self-citing, you should be using your full name and details of your papers, because if it is blinded, no one would know that that is a self-citation. And of course, we know that we should be trying to minimize self-citation or gratuitous self-citation, but there are cases where it is important to cite our previous work. The second common mistake is forgetting to change your name. If you're inserting comments in MS Word or in track changes, either as the author or as the reviewer. And again, many editors will be able to help in blinding this, but it is important to try and do so yourself. And then, as I mentioned earlier, including information such as ethics clearance reference numbers or funding bodies, if these include identifiable features. Including your institution is not really the biggest concern in terms of blinding, but some ethics clearances or funding references include your initials or your name, and that could compromise the blinding. So that was my very quick overview of the various forms of blinded review. The next thing I've been asked to speak about is Preprint Service, and it does link quite closely, and I'll explain why. So these are online repositories which allow you to post a pre-submission version of your manuscript online. They've popped up in about the last 10 years, and they're becoming increasingly popular due to first of all, a desire to receive feedback from your peers on an early version of your manuscript before it goes through formal peer review. Secondly, to put your name to a piece of work first, if you're working on a new discovery or working in a very fast-paced field, and you don't want someone else to scoop you by submitting it to a journal that perhaps is a bit quicker. Related to that is to then be able to get a formalized DOI for a piece of work early to, in a sense, tag it to yourself or your own name. But then the other reason why people are submitting to Preprint Service, and in some cases they actually do this after a paper is published, is to get around work being hidden behind paywalls. So by putting up an initial unproofed version, they're allowing much greater readership of their work in journals that aren't open access. So these can pose a couple of challenges. The first is that if we are submitting to a double-blind review journal, your preprint may expose your name. Again, you'd be using the same title, you'd be using the same text. And so it's quite easy for people to work out who you are if they want to do so. I personally don't waste time if I'm reviewing a paper trying to figure out who someone is, but I can't speak for all reviewers. The second issue is that it can allow research to circulate quite widely before the peer review process has been completed, which can drive at extremes fake news. And there was a lot of concern around this during the early days of COVID-19. There were vast numbers of papers that were being put out, some of them through the full peer review process, but many of them on these preprint servers. And because they haven't been checked by editors, by reviewers, there was a lot of dubious scientific output that was circulated in this way. And then the third is, for some journals, it can be a challenge in terms of plagiarism software, particularly if the journal is hosted on a lesser known server, or indeed if the preprint server is lesser known. Because it is the early piece of that work, it would match directly to what's most likely the first draft you submit to a journal. And so that can be a concern. And some journals do have very clear policies about preprint servers. Some journals have their own preprint servers that are attached to them. So when you've submitted to them, it uploads to their own preprint server. And some don't have a problem with this. But it's important that we find out what that process is before we submit to a preprint server. And then as the public, it's important to view these manuscripts as work in progress and to be aware that they have not gone through the full peer review process. And then the last thing I was asked to talk about is conflicts of interest. And so there are a number of ways in which conflicts of interest can arise in the publication process. The first is from the side of the authors. If they have a direct financial interest in the findings of their study, this is a particular concern in the medical fields with drug trials, but it does apply in a number of other fields as well. The second is if they have an indirect interest in the findings of the study. The third is if they suggest reviewers who are their own co-authors, friends, colleagues, or people who are just too close to the material to be able to give an objective review. And then finally, if their study tries to prove the efficacy of their organization or the approach that they're using without disclosing that they work directly for that organization, or that their organization would benefit from, in a sense, indirect publicity that comes from this. From the side of reviewers, on the same point as authors nominating reviewers who they know very well, reviewers might also be nominated either by the author or inadvertently by the journal, who are persons that they know very well professionally or personally. It is also possible that the reviewers themselves might have a direct or indirect interest in the findings of the study. If they're working on competing or very similar topics, there may be some kind of encouragement for a reviewer to delay, to stall, or to reject work to allow their work to be able to be completed in time. And also if they have a very firm support against or for a particular methodological approach, and they're not willing to consider other approaches that might be equally valid. And then from the editors, if they know the authors very well, professionally or personally, if they discuss the manuscript in depth with the reviewers that they appoint, if they are working on competing research themselves, as editors, we are all researchers as well. If they have direct or indirect financial interest in the work, or if they have any very strong institutional biases. So this is a list of a set of possible conflicts of interest from the authors, reviewers, and editors. It's by no means comprehensive, though. And it's really important that we are ethical in our agreement to submit work, review work, and edit work, and that we are aware of and disclosing any conflicts of interest. So that brings me to the end, Leslie. I hope I'm in time. Happy to take any questions at the end.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Then you certainly got a lot into a very small time, and there are lots of things for discussion. I'm sure people are, I hope people are frantically writing notes as we go, so that we can have some interesting discussions. I know that I am, and every time I'm in one of these webinars, I learn a whole lot of new things, as I am doing today. Our next speaker, so thank you, Jen. Our next speaker is Professor Christopher Isike. He's the editor of the South African Journal of Political Studies, and he's Professor of African Politics and International Relations at the University of Pretoria. And he's going to be talking to us on the very important issue of quality control, which follows on very well from the previous speaker. So over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Leslie, and good morning to all of you. Also want to thank ASSAf for the opportunity to do this. 10 minutes is a short time to talk about these issues. I've been asked to talk about quality control for, editors, new editors. And so I want to talk about quality control tips for managing an academic journal broadly. Both Professors Bobangizi and Fichet have already made allusions, highlighted some of the points that I will talk about, but I will just, zero in on those. And the first one I want to talk about, maybe I should start by saying that good quality control and quality assurance processes are essential for editing a journal, and these are very important things to think about. So a few tips that I think are important to consider would be one, for me, conflict of interest, which a feature that talked about in some ways. It's important to have a conflict of interest as a quality control and assurance measure, and it's so quality control and assurance starts from the editor, in my view, and or the editorial team, depending on whether the journal has one editor-in-chief, an editor, or they have an editorial team in place. It starts from the editorial team, the editor-in-chief, committing to not publish themselves during their term in office. So I've not published in any of the journals that I've been editing in the last 7 to 8 years, and I've also, of course, made sure that I publish in bigger journals so that it doesn't become a product of laziness. But that is important because otherwise, as an editor yourself, if you start publishing, you start what we refer to as inbreeding, where you self-publish basically, because the question of who edits the editor, who reviews the editor, who decides on what where to send the editor's papers, becomes important. So that's one. And a second point for me would be looking at the editorial policies of the journal. So if you're already appointed as a editor of a journal, you should, having taken a decision to not publish yourself in the journal, to then take a look at the editorial policies of the journal. So editorial policies then become important quality control tool. So it's useful to establish comprehensive editorial policies that outline the journal's scope, its focus, and its standards, and these need to be clearly communicated to authors, to reviewers, and to readers to maintain consistency and transparency in the journal's operations. One of the things that the editorial policy does is to then become a template for guiding you, and once they've been communicated to everybody, you are bound by those. And then I also want to talk about the role of the editorial board. And the editorial board plays a key role in managing, the quality of an academic journal. The board is responsible for developing the journal's policies and procedures, and sometimes, usually not the case, selecting manuscripts for publication and ensuring that the content meets the quality standards of the journal. Now, this is where the editorial board is active. Oftentimes, what we find is that the editorial board, we just select people or appoint people for the gravitas that they can bring to the journal, because of the reputation that they have. And sometimes if they are, the bigger the name, the more busy they are, and the less open to helping to be part of the editorial process of the journal. So it's useful. My advice would be to have a balance of highly qualified and reputable experts, and then those who would also be below that par and would be able to contribute to actually editing the journal. And then relatedly, the practice of having an editorial team consisting of the editor-in-chief, assistant editors, and a book review is becoming more popular. So it's not just the editor-in-chief or an editor making all the decisions and doing all the work. It's useful to have a team, an editorial team in place, so that it takes a bit of the work off one person. It's a good quality assurance measure if it is well managed. It can become problematic, but if it is well managed, it can become useful. My journal, Politicon, for example, has toyed with also having what we refer to as editors at large to be part of the editorial team to help reduce the work burden on editors, and in so doing, this helps to improve, quality. I think it's also useful to talk about formatting standards and author guidelines as a tool for quality control. It's useful to have clear formatting standards to ensure that the articles are consistent in appearance and aesthetics and easy to read. And this can include guidelines for font size, spacing, headings, citation, reference style, and submission requirements to enable the blind review copy, as Professor Fischert said earlier. Now, part of these standards, we should be clearly defined and communicated, include guidelines for authors, or some of them I've mentioned, as both ethical considerations and submission requirements. Now, this helps ensure that the submissions meet the journal's standards and align with ethical guidelines, of the journal. Now, one of the things I also do in Politicon especially is technical check. So the Taylor and Francis system enables the editor to put in place to undertake a technical check. So every submission goes through that technical check just to ensure that they align with the format of the journal, and for example, ensure that they align with they have a blind review copy, to enable a double blind review, which we do in Politicon. After that, the next thing I usually would do is to do a plagiarism check, and I think this is very important. These days we have a lot of intelligent criminals, and then with software, AI software coming up, it's useful for journals to have a plagiarism check as an important quality control process that can help to ensure the originality of the research that is being considered for publication and will be published if it's good enough. So I urge you to get your journals to get and use software tools to check for plagiarism and ensure that the articles submitted are original. And then it comes to the peer review. It is an important, in fact, many would say is the most important quality control process in academic journals as a peer review. As Prof. Mobangizi highlighted, it is important to put in place a robust a peer review process made up of experts to ensure the quality and integrity of the articles that are published in your journal. And because reviewers provide feedback on quality, accuracy, and the relevance of the research, and like she said, they suggest ways of improving the articles before they are published. And then I also want to talk about publication standards. Right. So I've got maybe 1 or 2 points to before I round up. So I think I would be okay. So publication standards are also important. I think academic journals should have clear publication standards that define the criteria for publishing articles. And these standards should be regularly reviewed and updated to ensure that they are up to date and relevant. And this really helps with, just standardizing your quality. I know we have someone who's going to talk about open access, but open access is another way that journals can ensure quality control by providing open access to their articles. There are all kinds of pushback on this, but it allows researchers to, access the articles easily and ensure that the research is available to a wider audience. And then the last point I would make is regular review of these processes, these standards that I've talked about. They should be reviewed regularly to ensure that they are meeting, a quality standard, and they can help to, they can include reviewing the peer review process, editorial policies, and other such measures that, a journal has put in place to ensure quality control and assurance. I'll stop here and hope that there will be time to engage some of these issues during the question and answer time.
Thank you very much indeed. I actually have a timer here, and Professor Isike has used your time absolutely exactly. So thank you very much indeed. And I think you've raised a whole range of things. There's already some activity in the chat that it's going to be important for us to discuss in the Q&A later, when we engage together as a community of editors or would-be editors. But I'm very pleased with how we're managing our time so far, and with the quality of what we're hearing so far. So things are going really well. And I'm delighted to introduce our next speaker. Our next speaker is Professor Christy Langeman from the Clean Air Journal. She's at the Department of Geography, Environmental Management and Energy Studies at University of Johannesburg. And she is going to talk to us about the very important issue of engaging with our authors. So over to you, Christy. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Morning, everybody, and thank you for the invitation to participate in this fantastic webinar series. So some of our previous speakers, Betty and Christopher, have highlighted the importance of integrity and transparency when engaging with authors. And I think also the need to ensure the good quality of publications is a given in any scientific journal. But so what I'm going to talk to you today is particularly the approach that we at our journal, the Clean Air Journal, have adopted in engaging with authors. And that approach is very much influenced by where we're at as a journal and who our authors are. So I'm just going to step you through that. And then I'm just going to talk through 3 specific things that we have tried in our engagements with the authors to promote our journal and to promote the authors. So just a little bit about who we are. I'm sure every journal represented here is a little bit different, and so that will inform the way that you engage with your authors. But our scope is explicitly a local scope, so we only publish articles that are of relevance to or based in Africa. We are an established journal. We use ASSAf's Colisa platform. We are indexed by Scopus. We are eligible for the DHET subsidy, but we don't yet have an impact factor. So we're often, if you have a very high impact publication, you won't come to us first. We are proudly open access, and we don't have article processing fees, which does mean that there are some trade-offs that we have to make because we obviously have less revenue. And we also try to publish material that's not just of relevance to the academic community, but also to policymakers, consultants, and the general public. So who are our authors? At the moment, for the last 2 years, I would say we're about 60 to 80% South African authors. So we still definitely have our base in South Africa, but we've made a concerted effort to expand into Africa. And so the balance of the authors are mainly from Africa, but around 10% are still from other countries, mainly the United States and Europe. And I think significantly more than half of our lead authors are students. So they are inexperienced authors. And occasionally, we do get authors who are not academics and who often might have some other motivation to publish. For example, suppliers of a particular technology, for example. And so we need to treat those with particular care. So our thinking is that when we engage with our authors, we have 2 end goals. The first one, which many of you, I suspect, share, is to publish as many good quality articles as possible. We are still looking to expand. And the second one is to increase our readership and the impact of the articles. We want our articles to be cited more. So when we engage with authors, firstly, to encourage manuscript submissions, to improve the quality of articles. We often feel that we as editors can play a bit of a mediating role so that we can get better articles. And then once we have the articles, we want to generate some publicity for them. So 3 things that we do. The first one is we try to adopt a helpful attitude. So I think sometimes if you engage with, very high-powered international journals, I feel that the editorial process, the peer review process, is punishing. And while we have to maintain the standards of peer review, we do try to be a bit helpful. So authors somehow struggle to follow the guidelines, so we do point out where they've gone wrong and encourage them to submit the complete manuscript. If there seems to be miscommunications between the reviewers and the authors, we try to mediate and help sort those out. One of our challenges is that as we are expanding into Africa, the quality of the English is deteriorating, and the authors can't afford copy editors, and actually neither can we yet. So we do play a limited role in assisting with the editing. And then I think all of us have high rejection rates, but we do want to make it clear when articles are rejected, why the article is rejected. And if resubmission is a possibility at some stage, we want to encourage that and to let an author know what they would have to do to get a manuscript that could be more favorably considered in future. Then the second thing that we do is we try to invite emerging authors to submit, or to encourage them to submit. So our publisher, the National Association for Clean Air, has an annual conference. And at that conference, we personally reach out to authors of good papers and say, why don't you consider expanding this paper, do this and this, and submit it to the journal. We are currently working on a special issue for authors from the International Conference on Air Quality in Africa conference, which is based in West Africa, and we traditionally haven't drawn many authors from there at all. So we're currently working with a whole new bunch of authors, which is great. And then we also involve senior students who have published a little bit, PhDs, well, not that postdocs are students, but postdocs, in the review process, in an attempt to get them more involved in the journal as well. And then the last thing where we've really partnered with our authors is in publicizing what they've published. So about 2 years ago, we always try and do something on the internet, the elegantly named International Day of Clean Air for Blue Skies. And so we created and then released every day a 1-minute video on articles that was published in the Clean Air Journal. And the authors of the articles themselves presented on the videos. And then this year, together with our publisher, we've launched a monthly seminar series where every month we invite an author of a paper to present on their paper, and then we have a question and answer series. And we're getting about 40 people attending, which for our community is fairly good. We tweet at the conference. We did try last year to increase the accessibility of our articles by inviting authors to record an oral abstract. That didn't take off, but it was worth a try. And then this year, prompted by working with all the West Africans, we are now encouraging authors to also translate their abstract into another African language and to publish that. Again, I think the articles will become more accessible, and hopefully authors also feel more included. That's it. Thank you. I'm happy to discuss more in the questions later.
Wow, Christy, that's my usual role in these meetings is being the bad cop, but I don't have to be the bad cop because not only you were actually completed in slightly less than the time that we asked you, so which is fantastic, because we do want to have time for discussion, and I can't quite believe how much you packed into those short 8 minutes and 15 seconds, according to my timer. And I think over and above what you have said in general for our meeting today, you've spoken a lot about the question of new authors, new journals, capacity building, and so on, which I think is a very important issue for all of us. It's certainly a big issue for the South African Journal of Science. So I hope that we can have time for some discussion about that. But thank you very much indeed. And we're making very good time and progress. We've got some lively discussion already happening in the chat, and I'm very pleased to introduce our final speaker, who's my old comrade and colleague, Dr. Pierre de Villiers, who is from the African Online Citation Systems, and he's going to be talking to us about open access and digital publishing, both of which have been touched on before, but there's nobody better to talk about this than Pierre. So over to you. Thank you.
Good morning, Leslie. I hope you can all see my presentation.
It's looking good.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I must say this request from ASSAf really took me down memory lane. This is the kind of presentation I was asked about 20 years ago to do. So I really enjoyed it, looking back again. And my presentation is about open access and digital publishing. So I thought it would be useful to start off with just a definition of each, to say that open access is about the fact that the works are freely available without any financial barriers through the internet, of course. That is the enabler. But there are usually some usage terms and conditions that may apply even though it's freely available. Then digital publishing simply means the electronic dissemination and access of scholarly works, making them, of course, more accessible and interactive. Now, this is really great for me to look at again about the history, the development of open access, because 20 years ago, when I started with open access, I was sort of in the middle of the revolution. So just to remind everybody that in 1991, more or less, early experimentation between scholars with sharing manuscripts over FTP servers started. In 2001, the Open Access initiative was kicked off by the Budapest Open Access Initiative, and they defined the concepts of green and gold. 2003, the well-known Berlin Declaration, which most of the South African universities, if not all, are actually signatories. And then in 2000, the first for-profit open access publisher, Biomed Central, was launched. And in South Africa, ASSAf, which is a similar publisher, was launched in 2003. When you talk about open access, there are many flavors of open access. The first one is the repository-based or green open access, the journal-based or gold open access. Then we've already heard, I think the Journal of Clean Air would be qualified as a diamond open access. It's free to read and free to publish in. We also know about hybrid open access. That is open access in a subscription journal. But there's also lesser known forms. The one is bronze open access. So the journal's content is actually available open access, but there is no open license. And then, of course, black, which is simply illegal. There are many benefits of open access, and I'm not going to talk through all of them because I think I'm speaking to the converted, and most people know exactly what I'm talking about. I think the last three to me is very important, and that is the rapid exchange of information between scientists, of course, leading to the fast scientific progress that we see. The public engagement and societal impact that this all creates. And then finally, something that is usually forget by people, and that is the cost saving and sustainability issues that open access brings to journal because of the burden of print that falls away. Now, what are the current trends in open access? The first is that there's still a very strong growth. In 2015, about 18% of new articles were published in open access, and that has increased to currently around more than a third. So we're not over the hump yet. However, in journals, we can probably safely say that at least 57% of articles are currently available in open access. Journals are currently available in access, and that figure comes from the Directory of Open Access Journals. The drivers are, of course, funding demands from authors, and of course, open access mandates. And the main growth area is gold open access and hybrid open access. Hybrid open access is also developing fast in subscription journals. And then finally, diamond open access is also growing, but that is driven by specific communities. It's worth considering the difference between open access policies and guidelines, simply meaning that a policy is a guideline and a mandate is usually an instruction. In South Africa, we have, as far as I know, only one mandate, and that is the NRF's mandate, which has a maximum embargo period of 12 months to become open access if you're funded by the NRF. And then I found that most universities have policies, but whether they can be qualified as mandates, I don't know. Perhaps some of the participants today can provide information on that. And all of these policies and mandates are usually supported by some funding support. Now, the digital publishing revolution started in the 1960s. However, let's remind ourselves that the first journal that was actually published was the Journal des Savants, the Journal of the Learned, which was published in 1665. 300 years later, the internet started slowly, and in the 1980s went public, and the first journal that was actually published in open access was in 1989, the New Horizons in Adult Education, followed by the first preprint server archive in 1991. And as far as I could ascertain, the first South African journal actually published in open access was in 1999, the South African Journal of Information Management, and the credit must go to Professor Pieter van Brakel. There are many digital publishing platforms available to journals today. There's the large commercial publishing platforms. Then there's the open source platforms like the Kulisa journals that we've just heard about. Individual journals can, of course, also use open journal system to create their own platform. There are many online repositories like PubMed Central where you can put your content on if you don't have your own platform. There are many preprint service we've heard about. And then, of course, there are indexes like the Directory of Open Access Journal and CIALA South Africa, who will also host your content on their server. There are many publishing tools that you can use if you publish in digital format, such as the DOIs help, with permanent web addresses for publications. There are things like altmetric. I'm not going to cover all of them, but then lately there's the big advantage of social media. Now, social media is a very useful way for journals to disseminate the research finding of wider audience and for individual researchers to connect with other researchers. By building a research community around your work, and you can also easier measure the impact of your research. However, just a few tips when you make use of social media. Always be professional. Avoid making any personal attacks or controversial statements which are not backed by your data. Also be selective. You can't share everything. Share only the most important and relevant finding. And finally, I want to caution, when you use social media to promote your journal, be patient. It really takes time and you have to build on this. So Leslie, that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you for putting everything that we do in historical context. Where we don't often think about ourselves in relation to the last 300 years. Thank you very much indeed. So I'm sure you'll agree, all of the, if we have now 112 participants at the moment, people coming and going, but it's a large number of people. I'm sure all of you will agree that we have had some really excellent presentations. I'm terrible at summing up what everybody has said, but I just want to pick out one thing from each of our speakers before I open the floor for chat, for discussion. I also have been looking at the chat and monitoring that. But I think if it's okay, Maputi, I'm happy to take oral questions. Maputi says, please make use of the chat box to post your questions or any comments. Okay. These will be managed by the facilitator. You could also raise your hand. Okay. But just we started off with an excellent talk from Professor Betty Mubangisi, and I just want to pull up. It's nice to see all the speakers suddenly appearing on the screen, whether you knew you were going to appear or not. I really loved what you said about editors being gateways rather than gatekeepers, because I'm misperceived. And actually it is our job to get material out there, even though the experience of readers is often that we're trying as much as we can to keep them out. Jen had a huge amount to talk about, and I think one of the important issues that Jen raised, which is interesting to talk about, is bias in editorial decisions and review decisions. And this can happen, in fact, even when everything is supposedly blinded simply because of where you're publishing from and so on. And that links to the Professor Isike's discussion about quality control, the role of editorial advisory boards, which I can expound on for a long time. It's one of those things that you pay no attention to until you really need them. And the intelligence of criminals, which I thought was an important thing to think about, particularly in this AI context. Christy brought us back to why we're doing all of this, actually, which is we're contributing to building capacity and building our disciplines within our context and within the African context. Issues about language, issues about oral abstracts and so on, really important. And it was interesting, Pierre, that you started off talking about how, in some ways controversial, the idea of open access was not that long ago, or how little understood it was, and how people have come round to the importance of it, and the importance of open science in general. So we have now approximately 50 minutes for some discussion and for questions in the chat. I'm going to go back to some issues in case people have not been following the chat, which I will summarize. There has been some discussion about it, and then we will ask for new questions. And please, all members of the team, please feel free to chip in. And I want to start with the question raised by, I think it was from Blanche, about whether we should ask authors to revise and resubmit when there are major issues with the submissions, or whether there's a new submission. I think this has been answered. I think who responded to this? I think it was you, Jen, was it? But would somebody like to deal with this, because I don't know if everybody's been looking at the chat.
Okay, can I come in,
Yes,
Leslie?
yes, please do, Betty.
Yes, I remember that question. I don't recall who asked for it, but who asked it. But essentially, they were asking whether once it's a desk rejection, whether the author is expected to submit it as a completely new article, a new submission, or if it is simply kind of a follow-up. And I think there are two ways about it, depending on what the editor has established at this initial assessment. Remember, it has not yet gone for review. So it's unlikely that the work is really content-based. It would be technical issues like you did not indicate your methodology, or you didn't say anything about ethical clearance, or the word, it is too long or it is too short, or things like that. And then they will ordinarily advise you to submit it, not as a completely new submission, but simply as a resubmission. That has been my experience, and that's what I generally do. If, however, the rejection is content-based, following a review, if it's content-based, then it's more likely that one will be asked to submit afresh. So it will be a completely new submission. I hope I've answered you. I forget who the person is, but yeah, essentially that's.
Thank you. I'm in complete agreement with that. The person who asked the question was Blanche. If you would like to, if you feel your question's not been answered, or if you'd like to unmute yourself and ask that question.
No, thank you very much. My question was answered. I'm talking specifically about the desk editing, and not obviously after the review process, which then is a totally different matter. I was just wondering whether when it does not comply with requirements, but it has a lot of potential, and you would like the author to revise according to your comments. It's not a review, it is simply, it does not meet the requirements, like Betty has explained. Then I just wondered whether you actually do a soft reject and ask to resubmit as a new submission, or whether you actually just ask them to revise and you upload the revised version for review. But thank you.
Jen's, brilliant. I think Jen's hand is up to respond to that as well.
Yeah,
and
so just two further things to add there. Some journals actually have a specific category for those conditions, and they ask you if it has been previously submitted, what was the reference number for that submission? So there are a number of journals where you can then link it back to your previous submission, and they'll then pick it up from that point. So that is one route of doing it. I know for the South African Journal of Science, we don't give you a rejection at that point, we give you editorial feedback, which then keeps the submission open for you to be able to resubmit work. But the point that I wanted to raise on this is towards particularly, I think, new editors, but also editors who are part of a team on especially broader journals, where we have to be aware that we are an editor that oversees a large area of work. So in my case, Earth and Environment is even broader than I'd ever thought Earth and Environment could be. That when we're doing a desk reject, it should be for those cases that Blanche has mentioned, where it's way over the word length, or it's the methodology isn't clearly described, or we don't have clarity about ethics, or perhaps it's outside the scope of the journal. But I think what we need to be cautious about as editors is taking the role of a reviewer at that stage, and particularly if it's not directly within our field. So what I'm arguing here is that it's not our place to write back to the author and say, you need to redo the study in the following ways. You need to use this statistical approach, or you need to increase your number of questionnaires, or you need to expand the scope to a larger geographical area or to a comparison. Because that's seldom our role as editor. It should be for us to then appoint reviewers who, if those are reasonable comments, would be able to draw from their own very specialist expertise to raise those comments. And I think for many of us, our journals are increasing in scope. And while we might approach that question from our own academic background in a particular way, it doesn't necessarily mean that that is what the state of the literature is or the state of the science is. And so perhaps just clarifying our role as editor in that desk rejection process.
Thanks very much, Jen. I think, Christopher, you also wanted to come in on this issue.
Yeah. On top of what they have both said, it's the point of, you know, why it's useful to have the technical check, like I said earlier on. So at Politicon and Ubuntu, I would do a desk reject as editor-in-chief if I take a manuscript through the technical check and it doesn't meet our requirements in terms of the journal, house style, font size, and all these other technical things. Then you can do a communication with the author to say, can you just revise your manuscript to ensure that it aligns with what we want in terms of formatting and all that. That kind of communicate, that can then be what Blanche calls soft, rejection. So it's not really a rejection; it's an opportunity to correct and resubmit at that level. Then, but then you get to the second point of desk rejecting. The one thing that I think wasn't said, and maybe Jennifer hinted it, is about scope. Right? As editors, you can desk reject, and that's what we do at Politicom and Ubuntu, when you see clearly from what you've read from the manuscript that it does not fit or address the scope of the journal. It doesn't fall within that. So you have to reject, because no matter how well and how good the article is, if it's not part of what we are doing, say for instance, the South African Journal of Political Studies, Politicon, if you write to me about a subject that is outside politics, economics, and society, or how they correlate, you talk about climate change and you don't talk about the politics of it, I may not consider it. It falls outside that scope. I would then advise you to send it to an appropriate journal, and even go ahead to give you suggestions on where you can send it to. So that is very, very important, especially when your journal is well sought after and you have lots of submissions. You will not be able to have time as editor-in-chief or editor to read through all manuscripts and make a call, right? So you begin to do technical checks and then, look out for scope. You can desk reject those and then, decide to then send the rest for peer review, and the reviewers will then have to take the decisions that will affect content.
Thank you. Thanks. Let's go on. There was another question. I'm trying to monitor the chat, but if members of the team feel that there are issues that have been brought up that need to be discussed more, please just jump in. We want to get the maximum benefit of all of your being here this morning. There was an interesting question. I can't remember who it was from. Was the question about publishing in your own in your own journal, and there was some discussion about that. Again, there was some discussion. Would anybody like to discuss that? I can just say, when I started as editor-in-chief of a new journal, which was the African Journal of Disability with Pierre, I mean, one of the first things that I was asked by my colleagues was, "Oh, you're establishing a journal, so you'll have a place where you can publish." And I, in fact, didn't publish there as editor, I think, for 6 or 7 years, and then in a special issue. I think, was Jen's hand up to respond to this? Yeah. Yes, Jen. Over to you.
Leslie, I have posted a response in the chat, but to pick up on that, I think the size of the journal and the structure of the editorial board really matters in this case. So, for example, the South African Journal of Science, we have an editor-in-chief, we have numerous associate editors, and our scopes are broad enough that if you were to submit a paper, the editor-in-chief would send it to one of the other associate editors, and there's an iron curtain between you and the review process, and a number of people on the editorial team who can keep the checks and balances. But by contrast, the South African Geographical Journal, when we appoint editors to that journal, we actually include in both the advert and our contract as a society that those persons would not publish in the journal for the duration of the time that they're editors, because it is so small and because the two editors-in-chief have view of the full journal. It would be very difficult to create that same kind of an iron curtain. So I think it really does matter what the size of the journal is. And then, as the question raised in the chat, sometimes it's really difficult to avoid it. So if you work in a very specific field, that might be the primary journal for you to be publishing your work, particularly if it is engaging in debates happening within that space. So there, again, it's for you to decide how involved do you want to be in the editorial process if that is a key outlet for your work, and then what is your position, and do you have interface with the editorial process if you are an author?
Any Christopher?
Yeah, so if that is the case, and I've said this on the chat, the author, the editor who submits a paper should not even decide on the level of involvement. The answer should be simply no involvement, because you cannot become a judge in your own court, right? So it's common ethical principle. It's a conflict of interest for you to decide how involved you want to be or not. You should not be involved at all. And so if you have a small journal like the one Hester mentioned, and it's not, it's very limited, and you are the editor and you have to publish, of course, by the nature of your job, then the journal should ensure that they have an editorial team in place that should be able to step up when the editor recuses himself or herself from that process. And until that whole process is completed, the editor should not be involved in any way. That would, and this should be made, this kind of process should be made transparent so that anyone who wants to scrutinize it in future can do so. And I think that the editor, if you're talking about a journal that may have limitations in terms of its coverage in a particular geography, of course, it's not the only journal in the world. There are other journals that have similar focus. You should then make it a point of duty to publish your work in those journals for the time that you are going to be editor of that journal.
If I can also chip in.
Yes, Betty, yes.
I mean, for big journals with lots of editors, it's very easy to for an editor to actually pass the credibility test. But I think a good way of going about it is if you really, because at the same time, you as an editor might have really good work that will kind of catapult the journal to give the journal very good publicity. And there's nothing wrong with you giving that good work to your journal. However, it could be through cases where the journal has a guest editor, such that you, or is a special issue with a guest editor, such that you actually are not involved whatsoever. But let me also say something about journals that are at the initial stages. You are publishing and trying to advertise and trying to grow your journal. It's probably not yet DHET accredited. And you're not going to get good academics putting their work in journals that are not DHET accredited. So from that perspective, I think it would be good to give your good work to that journal as a way of contributing to grow it, if that makes sense. But still, as Christopher says, you can't be a judge in your own court. You still need somebody to do it for you. So it is good to publicize your journal. It's very important, but to do it thoughtfully and ethically.
I'm muted, sorry. I was just wondering, just on the last point about growing a journal that is not yet accredited. I know that, Christy, you're in that position, and Pierre, you've got a lot of experience with that. And I certainly know that the African Journal of Disability, we became accredited, but it did take a lot of work. Does either of you want to comment on that? Because this is for new editors, so I imagine there are lots of people who are in this position. So, Christy, first, would you like to comment on that? Yeah. Oh, thank you for putting your hand up. Yeah.
Yeah. So we are accredited now, but it only happened.
Congratulations.
Yeah. Thanks. It only happened within the last 3 years, maybe. Yeah. So it was a real slog. I think the point Betty made about publishing our own work or personally engaging with people to say, please just publish with us helps. And then we also followed a stepwise process. So getting indexed by Scopus, the ASSAf was incredibly helpful actually with getting us onto Cielo SA and onto their platform. So yeah, it took a whole strategy, and it took partners. I would say ASSAf is by far the most important partner that you can have in helping to get you accredited. And then, of course, it helps your number of submissions greatly once authors know they can get the subsidy when they publish with you.
Yeah, Pierre, could you respond? And there's also a question in the chat at the same time about what, if you could just Tell us again what Black Open Access is. So quite a number of
Black
things.
Open Access. Okay, let me quickly start by Black Open Access. Black Open Access is where the content of a journal is put online in an open access format, in other words, freely available to download, usually without the permission of the publisher. And that is illegal. I know there are big legal cases in the world. What is the name of that repository that was started by this East European woman? There was a big controversy.
Talking about Sci-Hub.
Sci-Hub, yeah. Sci-Hub would be a good example of Black Open Access. It's illegal, and the less we say about that, the better. But to come back to the very relevant question of how to get your journal developed and sustained until you get accreditation. Now that's something we deal with every day, and you've done that very successfully, Leslie. So it is a matter of, first of all, of course, your journal needs to have a very solid academic reason for existence. There must be a need for that journal. And then you need a very strong editor, someone who is really well connected throughout the world and able to contact colleagues outside of South Africa to contribute good work for this important case. In other words, it's about an idea. It's about a goal that you have. In the case of your journal at the time, there was a desperate need for a journal that focused on disability. In Africa, I mean, Africa with all its people have so many, such a big need for research in that discipline. So it became very clear that there's a need. And then we have an excellent editor, of course, with well-connected, able to convince scholars from other parts of the world to contribute to this journal, because they don't care, apart from the fact that they like to publish in journals with an impact factor, of course. But for some of them, they would be amenable to support this particular course. So you need an editor with good connections to convince people who actually work on this project to get publications to the journal. And then your aim, I think, today, and that's maybe a tip that I can give to new editors with new journals hoping to get accredited. The best route, in my opinion, is first of all, go open access. You need to be open access. You need to be on a digital publication. And once you've started on that foot, your next aim would be to meet all the inclusion criteria of the Directory of Open Access Journals. Now, it's very explicit. It is on their website. If you follow those very clear guidelines and you publish a minimum of 6 original research papers per year, the chances are very good that you will be allowed into that index in about 2 years' time. And then once you're in the Directory of Open Access Journal, you met all our criteria, you're in that index, then you are accredited with the directory, with the Department of Higher Education and Training. And that, in my opinion, is the best advice that I can give today to editors who are not yet accredited.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks. That was really helpful. I'm not quite sure where to go next. There's been a really interesting discussion in the chat on the role of yes, but there's something I want to make sure that we deal with before we get to that, because this is the hidden bane of the life of any journal editor, which is getting in peer reviews. And there've been a number of questions about, is it acceptable while you're waiting for a second peer review to send feedback to an author? Is it acceptable to reject an article based on one review? I see Adrian's added something about authors who fraudulently make suggestions of peer reviewers who are actually themselves. I mean, this does happen, but for anybody who is a new journal editor anywhere in the world, and this is something where I have a kind of 30-year experience of being involved in journal editing, this is something which is getting worse, and we tend to think of it as only an African or South African problem, and believe me, it's not. I'm editing the Scandinavia at the moment, Scandinavian Journal of Disability Research, and if anything, it's more difficult to find reviewers than the South African Journal of Science. Anybody want to tackle this issue of finding enough reviewers, what you do? This be tips for new editors, and believe me, this old editor has open ears to hear what you have to say. Anyone want to tackle this one? Christopher, have you unmuted yourself? Or was it, or Christy? I see Christy's hand is up. You're going to solve the problem for us. Like, you got 5 minutes to save the world, Christy.
No, I'm just going to say, I feel like the problem has become worse in COVID. It just got worse. So we feel we typically approach about 6 reviewers to get 2 reviewers. So that's how bad it is, sometimes worse. sometimes better. And so we are increasingly looking at having one reviewer has to be experienced and established. But often senior students, PhD students, perhaps people who've recently graduated, they often provide really good reviews. They take a lot more trouble over the review, actually. And maybe they can be a bit tougher often than a more experienced reviewer. So that's one of the things we're trying, using more junior academics to do the reviews.
Thank you. Other comments from our panel? There's an interesting comment in the chat as well that I want to refer to.
Leslie,
Yes,
perhaps
yeah.
I can just jump in on the reviewer
Sure.
thing.
Sure.
Yeah, you know, we publish more than 50 journals now, and it's the same story with all of them. So if you have problems finding reviewers, please, it's not a unique, this is not only a South African story, it's an international story. There's a proliferation, as you've seen, there are 34,000 scholarly journals that they could count in existence. So, and everybody is trying to get reviewers. I think this, once again, your editorial team, your editor, your associate editors, and the people that you involve as part of your editorial team, they are the key. They need to apply their minds. They need to work through their networks. They need to build their reviewer database. And that, I think, is one of the most valuable assets of a journal, is their reviewer database. And it takes time. You don't do that in a year or so. It takes many years. A journal is a long-term project, I always say. The oldest journal we publish is 70 years old, more than 70 years old. So it takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of effort, hard work to get this eventually to a situation where you find that you can manage. So just stick in there and do your thing.
Thank you. Yeah, no, before I started chasing reviewers, I had a full head of hair. Look what's happened to me now. But Betty, I think you wanted to address this.
Yes, I want to chip in and to agree with Christy that postdoctoral students are the best. They are very good at reviewing. They provide really very insightful reviews, and they usually respond very quickly. So I agree with Christy on that. But what I found useful in the recent past, and it seems to work, is when you look at your previous issues, like say maybe the last 3 or 4 issues, and you see the good academics whose work you have recently published, when you ask them to review your work, I guess because they kind of feel beholden to the journal, they tend to respond actually quite quickly. So that is a tip that you can think of using. You know, if you just look at your previous issues and see academics whose work you've recently published and ask them to review, they kind of have that sense of, you know, they feel they're beholden and they have something to offer the journal. That might work. And then with the new platforms that we're using, the online submission systems, you generate a database of reviewers. And at the end of each review response, they will ask you to rate the reviewer. So is it 1 star, is it 2 stars, is it 3 stars, depending on a whole lot of criteria, depending on how quickly they've responded or the depth of their reviews, you can rate them. So when you're looking for reviewers, then you can easily go back to your database and see who your 5-star reviewers are and who your 3-star reviewers are. And then you kind of go to that one. So this online submission system has really helped. And I agree with Professor de Villiers that you know, these things, this database takes a while to build, but once it's built, it's very supportive and helpful. So those are my 2 pence worth.
Thank you. More than tuppence. No, that's not only it's not only inflation. Jen, your hand is up.
So it relates to this discussion. A comment just popped up in the chat about the South African Young Academy of Science and ASSAf. And because this is an ASSAf platform, I think it is important to raise. I'm a member of SciAS. I raised this at the SciAS AGM last year, and I've raised it within our editorial board meetings for the South African Journal of Science. But I think we need to put a much bigger call out to members of SciAS and to ASSAf to really encourage them to accept review requests from all of the South African journals as part of their academic duty and service towards the Academy. Being a member of SciAS and being a member of ASSAf, part of that is about committing to service. And it is frustrating when we do send out requests to members of these two groups and those requests go unanswered. So I think it's also about engaging. Those are two options. We also have a number of societies. I know Christy was talking about running a society journal. We've got a South African geography journal, but encouraging the members of those societies to also be responsive to these review requests. And it doesn't mean taking every single request that comes through, but some kind of process whereby people are expected or feel that they have a duty to do a certain number of reviews for their society journal or for the journals associated with, for example, ASSAf or SciAS in a particular year, as one way of trying to boost our number of good reviews and reviews from experienced researchers.
Thank you. I think this is something, this question always gets everybody animated because this is the thing. Pierre, you're going to solve the problem for us. I see your hand is up. Please unmute yourself, Pierre.
There you are. I'm toggling between all the buttons here to lower the hand. It gets confusing.
Yeah.
Yes, Betty spoke about, once again, about the database that you need to build. One of the handy tricks or tips that I can give, since this is tips for editors, is to make use of your submissions. When somebody's submitting an article to you, even if you do a desk rejection on that particular article, it may be very useful to add those people, the authors, submitting authors, to your reviewer, potential reviewer database. Making use of the area or the topic that they use. I mean, if you have a set of keywords, I presume, that you can then add them. So over the years, when your journal go on, you have a lot of people who published in your journal, a lot of people who submitted to your journal, and that could form a very useful database for you to use. And some of them may need diamond reviewers, so don't discard them.
Thank you. All excellent tips. Any other comments on this issue from our panel? Okay. Just on I think on that topic, there was a question, and I'm not sure who it was from, on whether we should be using editorial advisory board members as reviewers or guest editors. Yes, absolutely, because these are people who are experts in the field, and I certainly my own experience as a journal editor, these are often the people who I am able to do something which I think it was Julie Powell from Historia who said in the chat, personal contact with people rather than a computer generated request to review often is more likely to get somebody to agree to edit. I completely agree with that. And often when I'm really stuck in a corner, I suppose Pierre's been talking about this. I'm sure we've all done that. I use my social capital. So if there's somebody that I've done a favor for, I call in a favor, and they will, there has to be this kind of relationship. where one is able to draw upon people for our own journals, but also for other journals. It's also, you know, even if you're editor of Journal X, you should be prepared to assist with Journal Y. I'm wondering, I mean, one of the anxieties that's surrounding all of us, and I'm really interested while we have the panel here, is AI and what's going to happen to our Turnitin processes, which Christopher has spoken about, and so on. And I don't want to let this meeting close without some discussion of that. If anybody is brave enough, I have to tell you, I have no idea what to do. So how about a tip for an old editor about what we're going to have to do about AI? And do you have any experience of it already? Yes, Jane.
So we have experience through teaching, and we've had a number of AI cases that have popped up in the last 2 months or so. And interestingly, at a social event this weekend, I heard about a case where a person had taken an AI-generated heads of argument to court. And the AI had made up a bunch of references about case law that didn't exist. And they spent 2 months trying to track down said case law, only to realize that it was generated by AI. And the lawyer in question was then served with a fine for doing this, and had to pay not only for the legal costs, but also for all of the sending people on a wild goose chase. But I think there are some things that we're already starting to pick up. One is that Turnitin is actually quite good at detecting AI. The wording of Turnitin makes it quite difficult for us to act on it, because it says that there is a probability that text was produced by AI, whereas for plagiarism, Turnitin tells you that there is a direct match to text. So it does mean that as a journal, we would be able to pick up and write back to the authors and say, Turnitin is flagging that there's a probability that this text is generated by AI. We're not able to consider it. So I think in some senses, as a journal, we have greater power in that regard. In an academic setting, if you're refusing to mark work because of a probability of AI, we get into slightly muddy territory. But we do have the power as a journal to desk reject and to ask people to rewrite it differently. If it happens by chance that it thought it was AI and actually you write like a bot, well, then write differently. So I do think that Turnitin is stronger than we think it is. It is able to pick up AI. But I also think it's important to recognize that there is a wide spectrum of what constitutes AI and what constitutes AI-supported writing. Because we've had spell checks on our computers for a very long time. We have Grammarly, which many people have been using for a long time, which gives you suggestions on how to rephrase your work. And of course, typing into ChatGPT, please write me an article on, I don't know, climate change in South Africa, is very different to editing your own words using Grammarly. It is a continuum, and I think we're all seeing this as something brand new, rather than understanding that it is part of a toolbox that has been gradually growing over time. And that at the end of the day, what we are looking for is an argument that presents data that is real, references that are real. We've got the ability to do reference cross-checks in most of our journals platforms. So things like AI making up references, we'll be able to pick up. Things like AI making up data, it's not good at doing that. It's a text-based, it's a language tool. It's able to generate language. So I think for now, it's about being aware of it, but it's also about being aware of our tools on the side of editors, and the fact that we actually do have much of what we need to be able to detect it and to be able to deal with it, but to be cautious when we receive papers, rather than sort of trying to pick it up at the last stage when it's been accepted.
Thanks, Jane. I think here you must have a lot of experience on this. I see your hand is up.
Yes, Leslie, I almost lowered my hand because Jennifer has so adequately addressed the issue, but maybe just to say that, yes, we are monitoring this very closely. As I said, we publish a lot of journals. And so we have this bird's eye view that we have on a large group of journals to see. to date, nothing that makes me anxious has popped up. And I think Jennifer's advice to say that there are many forms of AI, relax. I would like to say to editors, relax about AI. Everybody's jumping up, you know, they're going to get paper mill articles and they have to deal with that. Yeah, I think it's a bit of a hype, that one. Just stick to your guns. Do what you do and do it efficiently. Use your Turnitin software to detect fraudulent papers. Make sure that obviously that there's no plagiarism, but also check your referencing. I think that would be a very good way of doing it. Making sure that all your references are real and valid. Somebody must check that. The reviewers don't do that properly. So you, as part of your editing process, you need to factor that in. And yes, we're using Grammarly to write. We're using spell checking to write. And now we're using AI. You know, I've been using AI, you know, because I'm not a first language English speaker. It helps me to formulate my language. And I think it's a game changer for people like me from Africa who are not first language English speakers to help you to express yourself better, because the AI is very good at that. You know, if you give them 2 paragraphs and say, okay, I'm a bit, you know, does this sound okay? Can you improve that for me? And then they write that paragraph for you so much better and clear that you think, why didn't I think about this in the first place? So it's wonderful. It's a wonderful tool. So let's bear with authors, let them use it to improve their writing. But of course, to create a paper mill paper and submit it, or to use fraudulent data, that's a completely different story. But I think we must rejoice that AI is going to improve the quality of papers that we publish in the future. But just keep an eye, be aware, manage it properly.
Thank you very much. Any other comments? There were a couple of things. Christopher, you want to say something on that?
Yeah, I thought Jennifer and Pierre have done justice to this. The only thing I will add is the fact that this is an evolving challenge, and so there will be hiccups here and there. But I think also that those who have the Turnitin is also developing software to try and you know, catch on ChatGPT. So there are linkages there that will help us in the future to arrest this particular problem, but it's evolving, so we shouldn't be too difficult on ourselves on it.
Thank you. Yes, and a lot of resources, Ina and various other people have put some resources in the chat and various techniques. I mean, I really like what you can do is you can ask ChatGPT, if you have some text, you can ask ChatGPT to say, did you write this? And that's quite helpful. Jen, can I ask you to keep your comments brief because we're getting towards the end?
Sure. It's not about AI, but just picking up on something that Pierre has said and Ina said in the chat about not being a first language English speaker. And it's a real bugbear I have, particularly when submitting to international journals, where even if you are a first language English speaker and you write very well, you get these comments, please have this proofread by a native English speaker, often by a reviewer who, by the comments that they leave, suggest they're not. And I think it's something in the South African context that we must really take responsibility for as editors. At the SAJS, we had a long discussion about how to edit review comments that come in that are unreasonable or unfair or harsh. And I think a big thing there is to temper comments about that and perhaps even engage. Christy was talking about the role that the editor plays in engaging with authors, but also with reviewers, in saying we actually don't think it's acceptable to make comments like that. Many of our journals do have either a requirement for copy editing before or after the process, but we must try with 11 official languages. We really need to try and shy away from critiquing people on the basis of their language and rather playing a developmental and a supportive role in addressing it.
And I think just as I'm aware that it's sort of 10 to 12 now, and we have to finish by 12 o'clock. So I'm going to ask Jenny. You've almost you've anticipated what I was going to ask. Like, is there a kind of take-home message? And the chat is going wild, saying, "Well said, Jen." So I think if you don't get a chance for another take-home message, that was a great one. Christopher, you wanted to give us a take-home message from your perspective?
Yeah, just in line with what Jennifer was saying about the role of the editor. It's like the role that you have to play when you are faced with two conflicting review reports or decisions. One says, excellent article published with minor revisions or even no revisions at all. And the other says, very poor article, reject. This is where your editorial instincts and responsibilities kick in. And so you have to then be able to take a decision. So what I've done, I don't even bother to engage with authors when they use less flowery languages and comments, give comments, harsh comments. My editorial instinct kicks in, and then you decide what is right, especially if you have expertise in this particular field. Or if you don't, Boisile was asking whether it would be useful to send it to a third reviewer. That could be possible, but usually an editor-in-chief should have some expertise and should be able to see where something is wrong and then decide where to go. And I think that responsibility should come in, and we should be humane about it as editors. That would be my last soundbite, if you like.
Thank you very much. Who would
Sorry,
like to?
Sorry, I meant to say developmental, not humane. Developmental.
Developmental. No, I mean that's absolutely clear. Christy, your hand is up. Your gift to the world now.
Yeah, I'm not going to give anything as profound as that, but perhaps what Christopher and Jen have been saying about, I think you do develop editorial instincts, especially after a few years. And so I often find we're three editors-in-chief, which is a bit of an unusual arrangement, but we will often just have a chat to each other in general terms and kind of say, these are the issues, because lots of sticky, I mean, we're small and we have several sticky issues a year. And we'll often just have an in-principle chat and say, look, this is what the reviewers are kind of saying, this is how I feel. And I'm always very impressed with my other editors. I always feel that they were going to make a good call anyway. And so that's, and our editorial board, we also have a few people there that we can call on, more as Leslie was saying, in an informal way, to just check what would be the right way to approach something.
Thank you, Christy. Absolutely. I mean, no single person. I think part of the message here is you have to be assertive. You have to be able to stand your ground, but no journal is run by one single person. It's not a vanity project for any individual. I think it's a really important point. Betty, have you any comments that you?
Yes, my closing bite would be to echo the sentiments I made earlier, that we are not gatekeepers, but are gateways to knowledge sharing and knowledge dissemination. And I see that Jennifer and Christopher and other colleagues on the panel seem to echo the same sentiments. So gone are the days of seeing an editor as that monster on the hill, but rather as someone that is supporting the academic project. And one way of really doing this, and because the industry, if I could call it that, is evolving gradually, is evolving every day. We're now hearing ChatGPT, we're hearing all these large language models and whatever. So we need to constantly come together to train, to engage in webinars, so that, and for not just editors really, but also reviewers and authors even. And this will promote guidelines to ensure ethical considerations in the entire review process. And so I really am grateful to ASSAf for organizing these kinds of things. We need them. Thank you, colleague.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Betty. Thank you. Very, very well put. Pierre, is there anything you'd like to say for your final comments for today?
I'm glad you didn't say my saving the world comment. Just to say that.
You
thank
saving
you.
the universe, not the world.
Thank you, Leslie. I thoroughly enjoyed this communication with my colleagues. It was, first of all, lovely to hear the excellent English from the native English speakers today, and to deal with all these challenging things as building reviewer databases and the new AI technology. When I prepared for this presentation, I had such a sense of deja vu, going back to where it all started. And look where we are today with scholarly publishing. I'm really very proud to be part of this industry. And thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you. I mean, it's my job to thank you to all of our speakers for making my job so easy as chair for engaging at such a high level so well, keeping to time, and really engaging on difficult issues. One of the comments in the chat that I just happened to have noted, and a number of people have said, the session made me feel less alone. And I think there is something actually often behind the scenes, maybe scrubbing to find reviewers, or we're dealing with very difficult ethical issues, and it's not quite clear, and authors are angry with us, or reviewers are angry with us. You aren't alone. So part of the function of this is so we can support one another as journal editors. Thank you everyone for your participation. I also want to say that just in terms of the hidden work of journal editing and the hidden work of journal reviewing, this is something which the ASSAf is looking at. There is a draft statement which is being reworked. We're hoping to engage with ASSAf is hoping to engage with the universities about this. This is really very important. But I also want to just emphasize, apart from thanking those of us who are at the front of the screen here, the enormous role which is played by the publishing division of ASSAf, with I see Susan, who always supports us, Ina, Maputi, Louise, all of you. My experience as a journal editor is that I can be in a panic, and I often am. That's part of my nature, and you're always there to depend on. And part of what you're doing by having these meetings for us is you're helping actually to build a huge part of the infrastructure of science and knowledge in our country. And your contribution in some ways is more important than anything. So I know that I don't speak just for myself when I say thank you very much indeed to all of you. Maputi has put in the chat, there is a, please do this, it's a little bit further back in the chat, I don't know if you want to do it again. Please, will you fill in your feedback, tell us how we can do things better, thank us if we are doing things well, but we also only learn by new comments. Give us new ideas, things that you want as journal editors, experienced and inexperienced. Help us all to work together to do better. The feedback provided in the evaluation form, as Louise says, is really important to us. So please do fill in the evaluation form. Anything else that I need to do? I'm, as I say, I'm just the guy at the front here. Maputi and team, is there anything else that I should say that I haven't said? Anything that I shouldn't have said that I have said? That's too late. But I think it just remains for me to thank everybody. Keep warm and safe. Keep supporting your journals, your local journals, your editors. And let's support one another. I'm sure people on this call, I know there are lots of people on this call who contributed to the chat, and those who were quiet, who don't mind. I certainly don't mind. I want to feel able that I can approach you guys when I have a problem, and I hope that you'll be able to do the same with me. So thank you very much indeed, everybody. Thank you for joining, and we'll see you at more of these wonderful events. Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.